Imagine waking up one morning and realizing that the world you once knew is gone. The streets are silent, bells are tolling endlessly, and the neighbors that you cherished so much are either dead or dying. What we're about to witness isn't fiction. It's the horrifying truth of life during the infamous Black Plague. But before we start, subscribe to our channel if you love dark history and want more stories that reveal the terrifying moments that shaped our world. The Day of Death. In the Sicilian port of Messina, which is in Italy today, it was a quiet market where fishermen were enjoying their catch. The market was buzzing with many customers, and the aroma of the sea filled the air. But then, on the horizon, a dozen Genoese ships appear, coming into the harbor in a hurry that the world had never seen. This time, something was wrong. No one was laughing. There were no shouts, and not even any movement on the deck. So, when a curious fisherman boards one of the ships, the thick, unnatural, and plain disgusting smell hits him. The decks were littered with corpses, and their bodies were twisted. Their skin was also marked with dark blotches, and only a few were still alive, though groaning softly, with their face swollen, and their eyes that had lost all color. This time, the ships didn't get riches or trade, but brought forward death itself, which no one knew about. And no one was expecting what was coming next, because within days, people began to die of a mysterious disease in Messina. In just a couple of weeks, the entire island of Sicily was infected, and this disease was finally named the Black Death, which is the most devastating pandemic in human history, much more painful than even the modern-day coronavirus. The Black Plague, also known as the Bubonic Plague, was haunting this island. But it didn't take long to make the whole of Europe fall. Before the plague's arrival, Europe was thriving. Cities like Paris, Venice, and Florence were growing with prosperity and peace too. Cathedrals reached for the heavens, trade routes were already thriving since they stretched across continents, and universities were all over Europe promoting education. At this point, the population had grown to nearly 80 million, but there weren't many problems. Food was abundant, faith was strong, and people believed that they understood the world. But in this golden age of Europe, something devastating was coming, and they had no idea. Before this, the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 had already revealed how delicate life was because crops failed, people starved, and entire villages were abandoned. And yet, no one could have predicted what was coming. An invisible killer that would not starve people, kill them, not make people abandon villages, but wipe entire villages itself. But you might be wondering, where did the Black Death come from before finally hitting Europe? The origins from the East. You see, Europe was not where this plague came from. The true origin began far to the east, in the Tian Shan mountain of modern-day Kyrgyzstan. There, in the early 1300s, a tiny bacterium called Yersinia pestis mutated into a new, deadlier form. At first, it spread silently among wild rodents, then was carried by the fleas, before finally leaping to humans. The trade routes of the Silk Roads, that was once the heart of wealth and culture, became a pathway that carried death towards the west. Mongol armies and caravans were unaware of their deadly passengers that carried the plague to the ports of Crimea. During a siege at the city of Kaffa in 1346, the Mongols were the first ones to be struck by the disease itself. This captured plague-ridden corpses over the walls, which was a silent form of biological warfare that no one was expecting. The Italian merchants who were inside fled in terror, boarding ships that were bound for home. But inside their holds were black rats and their infected fleas that hit among the cargo, which was where Europe's doom had also set sail. The arrival in Sicily. By 1347, when the shops arrived in Sicily, it took only a few days for the nightmare to unfold. The authorities looked at this disease and were horrified by it. They immediately ordered the ships away, but at this point, it was already too late. From Sicily, the plague moved like wildfire. First, it went from the north to Italy's great city, then to France, Spain, and England. Everywhere it went, death was always following it. There is this very famous story of Maria and the Black Plague. Maria was a mother in Messina. One week, her husband falls ill, and his neck swells to an outrageous amount. Then the guy's skin turned black, and within a few days, he was gone from the world. After that, it was Maria's children who went from the same fate, and by the end of the month, Maria herself lay in a hastily dug pit outside the city walls. The world lost another name to Black Plague. Just like that, there are millions of stories, each painful, but this was just the beginning of the terror of the Black Plague, the Great Dying. Between 1347 and 1352, the plague killed at least one-third of Europe's population, amounting to nearly 25 to 50 million souls. In Paris, corpses piled up so fast that the living could barely dig graves. The constant finding of church bells, which was once a symbol of life itself, became a song of death until there were no more priests left to ring the bell. In Italy's beautiful city that was now destroyed, Florence, writer Giovanni Boccaccio described how brother abandoned brother, father abandoned son. Here, the streets were lined with bodies, and the air reeked of decay until almost everyone was facing death. Moving on to London, the Thames carried bodies instead of boats, where entire neighborhoods were wiped out, with no one left to bury the dead anymore. Moving towards the villages like Tusmore in England, the entire population vanished completely, and their names only survived in the forgotten tax records. The plague was not sparing anyone. Kings, peasants, priests, and all died. The symptoms were where things would go to a whole other level, because it was quite painful, and would break down whoever it would make its victim. The Black Death took three terrifying forms. The first one was the Bubonic Plague, which was the most common. Victims developed large, painful swellings called buboes in their necks, armpits, and even groins sometimes. These turned black and oozed pus. Death would follow them within weeks, and this was one of the most painful symptoms of the Black Death. Next came the pneumonic plague, and this was just as painful, if not more terrifying. Here, the lungs were attacked, and instantly, victims would cough up blood and die in mere hours. This plague spreads through the air, and just one person's breathing could infect you, killing you in a couple of days or even hours at best. But these two aren't the deadliest form, because septicemic plague takes over the cake for being the worst form that shakes our core to this date. Here, the plague infected the bloodstream, turning the skin black as the body decayed from within. Victims often died the same day the symptoms appeared. At this point, doctors were already powerful, and they tried bloodletting, burning herbs, and even drinking urine. Some prescribed crushed emeralds or powdered unicorn horn, while others recommended rubbing onions on the sore or even bathing in vinegar. Of 1,000 things people tried, nothing worked. The few who survived only due to their luck, because medicine had failed, and with it, humanity's sense of control was also lost. As death spread, people were looking for answers, and when we don't have answers, they tend to blame. Many believed the plague was a divine punishment for humanity's sins. Bands of flagellants roamed the countryside, whipping themselves bloody in public squares. They were begging for God's forgiveness, and ironically, their gatherings only spread the plague further. Others looked for scapegoats. And historically, Jews were hated. Here, they were falsely accused of poisoning wells, leading to massacres across Europe. Thousands of Jews were burned alive in Germany and France. The madness was so complete that people believed that killing their neighbors would somehow save them. One of the famous stories is where a Jewish merchant from Strasbourg wrote before his death, "We die as you die, yet you call us the cause. What madness multiplies suffering through hatred?" These are words of pain, and the Black Death wasn't a physical plague alone. It was a psychological one. Fear consumed compassion, and faith was turned cruelly. Now, you might be wondering that this must be the end of the Black Death, but it was only the beginning. Civilization collapses. The feudal system, which was basically Europe's social order, began to crumble. The lords, knights, and the peasants, everyone was dying alive. Crops rotted in fields because, at this point, no one was left to harvest them. Moreover, priests died in droves performing last rites. Churches were empty. Markets were gone. And money itself lost all its meaning because no amount of money could fix anything at this point. In England, the government passed the Statute of Labourers to freeze wages. But that didn't matter. There were too few workers left, and the survivors demanded higher pay, more freedom, and respect. It was the birth of change, not rebellion. Families were decimated, and parents abandoned their sick children. Husbands fled their dying wives, and the social fabric that the world worked so hard to build was torn apart in a couple of months. Imagine a world where love itself had died. The sound of death. The world during the plague was very silent, except for the church bells. At first, they rang for death, but then they rang for the dying. Eventually, they rang for no one at all, because there was no one left to ring them in the first place. Bodies were dumped into pits by the hundreds. When the pits filled, the dead were burned or left where they fell. In many towns, survivors swore that they saw figures in black cloaks, roaming around the streets where death itself was choosing its next victim. In some ways, it kind of was, but by the 1350s the plague began to fade, not because of any cure, but because it had already killed so many people that there were only a few left to infect. Those who survived faced a world that changed forever. Fields were empty, and cities were half abandoned. For the first time, even farmers found power. Labor was scarce, and suddenly their work had many values. Ages rose, and the rigid social order began to crack. Some historians also argue that the Black Death paved the way for the Renaissance. From death came rebirth. The church was weakened and questioned. At this point, people began turning inward for faith. The plague had destroyed the old world and forced humanity to build a new one. By the time the plague was gone, up to 200 million people across Eurasia and North Africa were dead. Cities were ghost towns, trade routes were abandoned, and entire families were erased from memory. How do you think we would deal with a deadly plague like this if it even came to the modern world? Let us know in the comments down below, and subscribe for more deep, chilling explorations into the past.